Welcome to the Student Ministry Matters podcast. We want to encourage, equip, and connect those with a passion to impact the next generation for Jesus Christ. Student ministry can be a lonely place. You might even feel like you're the only one in your church or community that cares about students. Well, know this, you're not alone. People all across the country are engaging Gen Z and care deeply about the spiritual direction of these young men and women. Whether you're full-time, part-time, bivocational, or volunteer, if you have a heart for students, this is the place for you.
Welcome to another edition of the Student Ministry Matters podcast. We're thrilled that you've chosen to download and listen as we continue the conversation about student ministry. If you like what you're hearing, let me encourage you to hit the subscribe button and share the podcast with your ministry friends. We continue to grow in our reach across the country and would love to connect with you. If you have questions for us, please reach out through our website, studentministrymatters.com, or email us at info@studentministrymatters.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. On today's podcast, we're talking about marriage and student ministry as I share an interview with David and Margaret Bronson. David and Margaret are a ministry couple living and serving in Jefferson City, Missouri, with their 4 children, 7 and under, a robot vacuum named Siobhan, and lots of plants. David serves as the student pastor at Concord Baptist Church and has been working in ministry for 10 years. Margaret is a writer, stay-at-home mom, and produces their podcast, The Already Not Yet podcast. You can follow David on social media at D_M_Bronson and Margaret at The Bronson Band. I hope that you'll listen with an open heart as they share some great concepts about marriage and ministry. Thanks for being on the podcast with us today, David and Margaret.
Thanks for having us.
Well, it is a special treat. David is a man who holds a special place in my heart. A couple of years ago, he spoke at the very first Student Ministry Workers Retreat that we hosted in Little Rock, and he jumped in kind of at the last minute for us, but he was exactly what we needed. And I was just so happy to meet him. Then when I found out that you guys are in the process of sharing some teaching through a podcast, I thought, I've got to have you guys on Student Ministry Matters. This is going to be a great way for our listeners to get to know you a little bit better. And so I wanted you guys to just start, maybe tell a little bit about yourselves and about your podcast.
Yeah. So it's worth saying that this podcast that we started is called the Already Not Yet podcast. And this was Margaret's idea. I had my head down plugging away in the midst of Corona tide, and Margaret had the idea that it would be really useful, especially for folks who were unable to be a part of a local church for various reasons, or were just separated from their local church because of COVID, to put together a podcast that was about the tension of living the Christian life in the midst of sort of the already of what Jesus has done for us in the gospel, and in the not yet of what we're looking forward to what he will do. So hence the name, the Already Not Yet.
That's great. You know, as we look at some things today, we're going to be talking about marriage and ministry. And I know that you have chosen right now, you're in a season with your podcast talking specifically about marriage. Could you talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah, we first of all, you can teach a whole lot of theology by talking about marriage. And so we wanted to start there, but also, especially with COVID right now, but also just marriage all the time, it takes a lot of work and it's difficult. And we saw a real need for accessible teaching on marriage, just really practical, but also like not neglecting the why. And so we tried to put together a podcast that would be as close to like premarital counseling, but it's not just for people who are before getting married. But yeah, so that's what we tried to do, as close to that as you can get with a podcast.
Yeah, with an eye toward making it as accessible as possible toward folks who are single, or people who've been married a really long time, or just wanting to think about it seriously.
Well, it is a great topic, and it's a great place to start, especially when you consider what you were talking about. And you've shared on your podcast, talking about how you'd have people come and sit on your couch and just basically share some of those same discussions with your listeners now. And so see a lot of value in that. Well, again, we're talking about marriage and specifically about student ministry because there's a lot of specific things that, unique challenges. There's some great benefits and some all sorts of things around there. But, I want our listeners to know you a little bit better. And so how long have you been in the ministry, David?
So I've been in the ministry about 10 years. And funnily enough, a good chunk of that wasn't in student ministry. But at present I'm working as a student pastor. And Margaret has very much been in that with me.
We've been married 10 years, so I've been there.
Since second one.
Yeah, that's one of the, blessings and curse as we'll talk about. But my wife and I, we got married when we were in college. My wife knew full well that she was marrying a minister. She knew that that was the life she was signing up for.
Yeah.
Although she wasn't quite sure of what that was going to look like.
Right.
She knew she signed on the line. So that's all that matters. And 27 years later, here we are. So, well, to let our listeners get to know you a little bit better, we've got Christmas coming up. I don't know if you're a great cook, Margaret. Okay.
Yes, she is. Sorry, this is my passion right here.
Oh, wow.
Margaret can cook.
Okay. So what is your favorite Christmas goodie that she makes then, David?
Okay, so you got to understand that when Margaret and I got married, this was a matter of a Philly girl who knew her way around a kitchen, getting married to a country boy who barely knew his left hand from his right. So I'm a simple man. Margaret makes pies that just rock my world. I think probably one of my favorite things she does an incredible apple pie I couldn't even tell you how she does it. It's just
he's so simple.
Cocaine.
You just put some fruit and some pastry, and he's happy.
Like I said, I'm a simple, not Led Zeppelin, Leonard Skinner song, "Simple Man." That's me.
Give me pie. Oh my goodness.
Pie's
apple pie. You're speaking my love language there. So, well, how about you, Margaret? Do you have a favorite Christmas goodie?
For me, it would have to be Buckeyes. They're like peanut butter dipped in chocolate little candies that people make for Christmas. We always made them growing up, and it takes hours to make them. But you can watch a really good Christmas movie while you make them, have some good conversation. It's more of the experience. Yeah. It's more of the experience.
It is that experience. One of my favorite Christmas goodies is Christmas cookies, just that basic thing. But it was always about the family having all that dough out there, putting the little sprinkles and making designs. And that's great.
I like to think I'm the fun mom, but we have not, with our little ones, done Christmas cookies yet because I just can't. I don't know. I'm going to wait till they're a little bit older.
Well, all right, Margaret, how old are your kids? I know you've got an 8-year-old as the oldest.
Yeah. So she's actually 7, and then we have 5, 4, and 3. So the little ones we've got 3 boys, and then our oldest is a girl, and she's 7.
Can hardly believe it.
Yeah, it goes by real quick. But again, as you look at marriage and ministry, and marriage especially with student ministry, and there's some challenges working around that sort of thing with your own kids. My kids survived that experience. They are now functioning adults and had their dad as their youth pastor for the biggest bulk of the time. But I want to ask you guys, what are some of the challenges of being in ministry and married with a young family? What are some of those challenges that our listeners might need to hear about?
It's funny, when David was applying for jobs, he specifically looked for worship and for preaching positions, but not for youth positions, because I was like, we've got young kids. We can't take all these late nights, and, I don't want to be putting the kids to bed by myself all the time. And so I was really surprised and a little frustrated, I think, at first with the Lord that he called us to youth ministry. And though I love youth ministry, it just felt like the wrong time for it, I guess.
Yeah.
But so it is hard. It is hard on marriage, but the Lord is faithful.
Yeah, and the good news about that I suppose we can kind of headline the thing with is that what we've discovered over time is that, if God calls you into something, he's going to give you a way through,
exactly.
kind of sharks and minnows, there's always a way through. So it's rough, certainly, but it also has its really significant and unique blessings.
Right.
Let's dive a little bit more into those challenges. Just again, we speak to the full-time, part-time, bivocational, and volunteer student ministry workers. And sometimes we look at student ministry with very romantic ideas. This is going to be those great, deep conversations that you have with students, and you're going to be able to take them on trips. And then all of a sudden you realize, oh, wait a minute, I've got kids of my own. How do I balance all of those things out? So I think you hit on a real key, the time management maybe, or the commitment. What are some of the other challenges that you face, very specific?
So I think one thing that often gets overlooked in student ministry. Yeah, so there are all these deep conversations, and that's good. But we're talking about teenagers here, and one thing just from a psychological development level that they haven't quite figured out how to do yet is how to define really well what a crisis is. So sometimes, and if you're listening to this and you've been in student ministry for any length of time, you've probably experienced this. You get that 3 a.m. phone call, or, school lets out and, the teenager blows your phone up with texts or whatever, and they're describing something to you, and they're describing it as sort of this end of the world crisis for them, like this really critical moment. So one of the challenges is going, okay, so I've got this student who's telling me that like they need something from me pastorally, like now, but I also know that I've got
dinner's on the table.
Right, dinner's on the table.
Yeah.
I got a kid's ball game that I got to be at or whatever.
Right,
and
right.
So this is kind of on the ugly side of things, I suppose. But sometimes the hard part is learning how to say to that student, like, okay, we're going to get you through this, right? But you're going to have to hang in there for 12 hours or 24 hours until I can, adequately discharge my duties to my family and take care of you. And sometimes you get that wrong. Sometimes the thing you think is not that big of a deal in a student's life ends up being this massive thing that you just missed and that you needed to be there for pastorally. And then the other way around is true too. Sometimes you'll have a student call you and it sounds like the end of the world, and you jump and you get there and you find out that it's something that could have been settled with a 30-second phone call, and you skipped out on dinner for the third night in a row. Mm-hmm. It's tricky. It's a tricky balance.
And yeah, there's always half the youth group always thinks they are in crisis. And many of them are.
Yeah.
So there's just a lot of need.
Yes. And you combine that with small kids who are your own children, who themselves have a lot of developmental and spiritual needs, and they need mom there, they need dad there. And so learning how to fit those pieces together, that can be a bear.
Yeah, and sometimes the biggest problem in that is actually not the teenagers' expectations, but the parents of those teenagers, their expectations, and, them wanting David to parent their kids to the detriment of parenting his own kids. That's hard.
Yeah, that can be tricky. That can be very tricky.
One of the things that I've seen is just a huge issue in student ministry in general is a lack of real understanding that the spiritual formation of my child is my responsibility as that parent. And as a student pastor, as a student ministry worker, we're often stuck with responsibilities that shouldn't be our responsibility. Yeah. And so helping those parents understand that can be tough and difficult. Well, it does have, there are some challenges trying to balance those things out, trying to figure out, okay, what is a crisis and what is not. I love that because that's right on target. What are some of the blessings, though, the positives of being in ministry and married and maybe even with that young family? What are some of the things that you think, this is great? I would recommend this to everyone because of these things.
Yeah. So honestly, one of my favorite bits is that I get to bring my kids along in ministry. That's good on one hand. That can be on one hand very good for them in that means they get to participate.
Yeah.
And so there's I suppose this is a delicate line to cross, because not everyone's kids are going to be wired this way. I certainly wasn't as a pastor's kid. I wasn't wired to be the kid who was in the room while ministry was happening. But Margaret and I are fortunate in that ours are. They genuinely enjoy being around our students, and they get the benefit out of having a whole bunch of big brothers and sisters that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise. Yeah, which is really cool. And then on the flip side of that, it's good for the students too. They get a chance to take a little responsibility on one hand, in the sense that we have groups of students that come and hang out in our living rooms at night, sometimes after gatherings, and we'll just have a whole mess of kids over here. And so they'll, some of them they get the chance to see a form of family life that they don't see at home for themselves. They get the chance to see what it is to take care of someone who's younger than they are and is needier than they are. And there's a lot of good opportunities that come about.
Yeah. I mean, it's a ministry in and of itself. There's your teaching ministry, and then you're speaking into their lives, but then there's also modeling. And the fact that we're just in a season where we can invite them in to see a lot of that, and just having them in our home is a ministry in itself. And that our home is very teenager friendly, because it's, 4-year-old friendly.
Right. Now, there's risk that goes with that, of course, that probably has to be acknowledged. I mean, there's always the risk of, unfortunately, things like child sexual abuse. You're bringing people into your home, and you've got to be very cautious and careful about that. But there's a remarkable thing that happens when you're talking with a young man about what it is to, be a godly man. And at the same time, he's watching you change a diaper. Oh yeah, here's what it looks like, kiddo.
Yeah, I can't say that I ever saw a diaper change until I was standing there changing my son's diaper.
Yep. That's an experience.
Yes, it is. And so, those are positives. Those impact your students. What about you as a couple? How is it positive, or what blessings do you find in being involved in ministry together?
Yeah, so we've just discovered, and I think some of this has to do with just the unique ways that God's wired us, but we've discovered, man, we're just better when we're ministering together.
Yeah.
The difficult times for us maritally and in ministry have come when we actually tried to separate those things out.
Right. And you pit the church against home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whether you're, whether you're looking at your timesheet and going, man, I've spent way too much time here. I need to sort of back off and put more focus here at home. You can inadvertently fall into this trap of thinking of the two as being at odds with one another. When I think, if you're looking at the biblical picture of what it is to be a pastor, the idea is that your engagement with your people, whether they're students or whether we're talking about, adults, this really can apply to any position in ministry. Your life is your ministry to these people. And so Margaret and I have always found that the sweetest times for us in terms of marriage was when we were keying together on that stuff, working on things together to make them happen.
And I found that in the, because he's had several ministry positions outside of student ministry directly. And what I found is that there's a lot of freedom in student ministry. At least in our experience, the senior pastor or the personnel committee, whoever is in charge, is less involved in the day-to-day decisions and overseeing how everything is done, that there's a lot more space for me to come along and find where I fit in. And so I've been able to, especially as the seasons of my life have changed with going from, we started out, we didn't have any kids, and now we have many children. I've been able to find what works for me and fold myself into it, wake up at 5 a.m. and go to Starbucks and run a girls' Bible study, or, have the kids in my house from 8 to midnight every Wednesday, whatever it is, pre-COVID. Yeah. And
yes, we'll be sure to add that.
Pre-COVID. So I think I really enjoy student ministry for the way that it allows me to serve with David and to really see how I can be a helpmeet to him.
As I look at my own story with me and my wife, we've been married 27 years, and we've been involved in ministry all that time. You're right. Youth ministry does allow a great deal of flexibility, but some of my best youth ministry years have been those times where my wife has really found a spot within that ministry and able to invest in a very specific way. She is a professional counselor and I believe she's a brilliant woman. And
co-sign that.
And so I feel like that God allowed her to be in these specific spots. And now she's not involved in my ministry as much. I'm the family pastor, meaning I'm in charge of children through college. And it's just that we're at a different place in our life. Our kids are both in college and we're a little bit older. So it all looks differently. But still, having a church that gives you the flexibility of finding that spot, and whether it's because of the ministry that your husband's in, or it is because of just the flexibility of that congregation, that's a powerful thing. That makes ministry and marriage work so much better.
Yeah, and as the pastor's wife, there's also the freedom to not participate because I think kids' expectations are lower on their youth pastor's wife than adults' expectations on their pastor's wife.
It's often true.
So I have been able to completely step back at different times, and it hasn't really hurt anyone's feelings.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. Well, do you have any other blessings or positives of being in ministry, things that you've just enjoyed?
The kids are great. They're really fun. We enjoy having them over for game nights. Our kids are too little to play board games, at least the kind that we enjoy.
Right.
And so having a couple of teenagers over and getting a good game of Risk on.
Yeah, that's pretty much the only way we get to scratch that itch. So, for those of my students out there who are listening, thanks, guys. That's a really good bit.
I totally hear you on that. There's a window when your kids can play some of these great games, and then they don't want to, or then they have stuff they have to do when they're too old. So anyway, well, I appreciate you sharing some of these things. There are challenges. There are definitely challenges out there. But at the same time, there's some blessings for being in ministry. And while a church doesn't hire my wife, they're hiring me to do that work of ministry. As a married couple, we come in that together. It's just who we are. And it sounds like that's who you guys are as well. What are some things that our listeners can do to strengthen their marriage? Especially now, again, our listeners are student ministry workers.
Yeah.
They are men and women who are working with students, maybe volunteer, maybe they're full-time, in a whole range of approaches to it. But what are some things that they can do to strengthen their marriage specifically there?
I think that one of the biggest things that we've had to learn through student ministry and all ministry, but I think specifically student ministry, because you're dealing with people who have not learned proper boundaries, not that all adults know proper boundaries either, is just to be really good at communicating. And even you might not know what's wrong at first. You have the sense that this isn't working, something's off here, and you just gotta have to almost talk it to death until you figure out what the problem is and where the breakdown or the false prioritization is.
Yeah, there's all kinds of ways that being involved in student ministry and ministry in general can kind of create rub in your marriage, and very often they happen at almost a subconscious level. Just the wear and tear over weeks or months or sometimes even years. And so, the number one thing I think, shy of just diving deeper into Jesus, is learning how to communicate really well when you don't quite know what the problem is.
And trusting your gut in it. Because sometimes I'm like, man, I don't like this, but I don't know if it's because I'm being selfish or if it's not valuing this ministry enough, or if it's, something, there really is a breakdown here. And so I don't know, I guess just trusting your gut and being willing to communicate and trust your spouse enough in that communication, even though you know that you might get to the end of it and realize, yeah, you were just being selfish and you're going to need to apologize and repent.
Yeah, but that's an important note to that, is that means that you and your spouse have agreed to create a safe space in your relationship for that kind of communication, for you to be able to sit down and say, all right, look, maybe I'm being crazy. Maybe this is just ridiculous, but maybe there's something going on and I can't put words to it, but something feels off, something feels wrong. Be able to do that without being called crazy or being, put in this position. Or just
defensiveness.
Where you have to over-explain yourself, where you work with one another to try to figure out what's going on.
Well, let me ask this question. I know that on your podcast, you talked about kind of sitting down together on a regular basis. And is there a proper amount of time to do that when you're thinking about your marriage and ministry? Does that need to be done more or less or the same? I mean, what do you think there?
That's a really good question, because every couple is wired a little differently, of course, but I think by and large, there isn't a marriage in the world that wouldn't benefit from more sitting down and taking face-to-face time to really work through things together. So one thing that Margaret and I do as regularly as possible is we have a list of questions that we ask one another that we've just kind of worked up over the years. And it's really simple, basic things like, how am I doing as a husband? How am I doing as a father? Is ministry getting in the way of our relationship right now? Or, and then sometimes even more specific things than that. So like, everyone's got their little pet peeves that happen in marriage. We create room for those questions too. Things, and I have a chronic illness. So one of the questions is, how are we doing at balancing that and marriage and ministry? But the idea is that by sitting down and deliberately asking these questions that we know are coming on the front end, we're able to both prevent some conflict from happening,
and create a safe place for that conflict that we don't realize we're already in.
Right, exactly. And also strengthen the things that are already going well. So sometimes, Margaret will ask me, or I'll ask Margaret, how am I doing as a husband? And the word she comes back with for me is just so encouraging. She's able to point out things that I didn't even know I was doing well. And that brings us together just as much as the conflict management is.
Yeah. But as far as like how often I don't like rules. And so I think that it's, I'm a recovering legalist. So I would say,
well, there you go.
Yes.
Like, no, it's just whatever. I would say you can always do more, but not in like a heavy burdensome way. Just, I think that we struggled because when we were told we had to have like a weekly date night, and we don't have local family, and we've got 4 kids, and that was really heavy. And we felt like, we were failing because we weren't able to make that happen.
Yeah. The people who say that have never tried to live on a minister's salary.
Oh, wow. Yes. So true. So true.
But liberty is the word, I guess. Like you do what you need to do when you need to do it. You just make sure that like when sort of that red flag goes up, okay, we need to do this, you step in and don't put it off.
I think one of the things that I'm hearing is there's just this great need for communication in any marriage. That's going to strengthen any marriage. But I think in terms of ministry and marriage, maybe even a greater need, if that's possible, simply because of some of the extra pressures and things that we face as we deal with church members who think we're doing things wrong, or maybe think that we're wearing the wrong things, or that our spouse is wearing the wrong things. I mean, it can just hit you so many times in so many different ways. But I love what you said, Margaret. I don't like rules. So, but the rule is you got to communicate. And I think that's one that it sounds like you follow all the time. And so that can definitely strengthen our marriages in ministry. Any other thing that you'd want to mention in strengthening your marriage?
This is going to sound prosaic, but it's categorically true. The more I am enjoying Jesus, the more I'm enjoying my wife, and the more I'm enjoying my marriage. And I know that sounds almost like a Sunday school answer, but I'm telling you, when my own spiritual life is dry, when I'm not constantly going back to the well of the gospel, just refreshing myself in that, then man, it's easy to be short-tempered. It's easy to take it personally when, that beloved older saint criticizes you because of the pants you wore on Sunday. And then you come home and you inadvertently kind of let that out at home. It's easier to do that when your eyes just aren't quite as focused on Christ as they ought to be. And I don't want that to sound like another, try harder, do better type routine, because we get enough of that. But man, soak yourself in the word, soak yourself in the good news about what Jesus has done for you. And it becomes so much easier for that to just overflow in your relationship with your spouse. And man, that'll do anybody a lot of good.
Yeah. And to that end, one thing that we've been trying to do, we don't do it perfectly, but is to really and truly take one day out of 7 to rest. And we have strong boundaries around that day. We don't, any other day, there might be a crisis that happens and David will have to be called away from dinner or from bedtime. But this one, unless there's like a funeral or something, David's home with us and we spend time enjoying each other and making space for communication. And David gets to focus just on his own spiritual health and our marriage and parenting. And it makes those other 6 days where I don't know if I can count on David coming home tonight or, he normally does, but it's that there is a lot of
out there running around.
Right. There's a lot of, I don't know. It's very hard when even if it's just 1 or 2 times a week, half hour late because somebody did something or whatever.
Right.
Especially when you have little kids and you only have 2 hours in the evening together before bedtime.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
And so just, it makes it so much easier. I can be so much more patient and gracious and understanding when I know that I have this safe time that is secure and that I will be able to rest and relax. Because when he comes home and it's not that time, I know that someone might text and it's hard to totally let down and relax and let him re-engage as father, husband in the family, knowing that I might have to pick up the reins again by myself at any moment.
Well, David, do you experience that a lot? Do you get called out much?
It's I found that it's been different in every ministry position I've been in. Actually,
Right.
the student ministry position I was in before this one, I almost never got called. It was just, there was a very low maintenance group in that regard. But in the position that I'm in now, we have a lot of students from a lot of different schools represented. I think that's part of it. But
Well, and you don't have very many volunteers.
right, we don't have a whole lot of volunteers either. So in the situation where I might go, hey, you know what? I know so-and-so's in town. I'm going to have him have lunch with you. I can't do that as much as I might. And with COVID, the mental health struggles of our students are just incredibly intense right now. So there's been a lot of dealing with just very acute,
genuine
situations.
crises.
Yeah, really
Yes,
honest to
yes.
goodness, to the wall crisis stuff. So that's happened more in this position that I've been in of late than historically. But yeah, that happens.
I know if I'm not careful, I can schedule myself out on the evenings very easily because of ball games and concerts in a normal year. But it's still, when you get those calls and things are just going on in students' lives right now, in their hearts and their minds, they are confused. They're just anxious.
Yeah.
That's a good way to look at it. They're just anxious, and you can't blame them because most adults are anxious right now.
Of course.
And so how do we deal with that? Well, it's tough. It's tough. Well, I've heard, you've mentioned time, communication, and I would assume this is for both of you. David, you mentioned it, but I think that for the husband and wife, this idea of the more time I spend with Jesus, that's going to make that relationship better and stronger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate you guys being able to just take a few moments with us today as we talk about marriage and student ministry. I know that it does present some specific challenges. There are some hard things. You may have experienced something different than what David and Margaret have.
Oh, yeah.
You may be going through some tough things as one of our listeners, and we want to be here for you. And you can always reach out to us at info@studentministrymatters.com. I'd love to talk with you, love to share with you, help you as much as I can. That's what we're about. That's who we are. And so, David, Margaret, if someone wants to learn more about your ministry there in Jefferson City or about your podcast, what's some of the best ways for them to do that?
Well, our podcast, the Already Not Yet podcast, you can find pretty much anywhere that you get your podcast stuff. So Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts. You can just Google search that and we'll come right up. Our church, Concord Baptist Church in Jefferson City, Missouri, you can take a look at the website there, concordjc.org. But as far as interaction with us goes, Margaret is on Instagram at the Bronson Band. And I'm on Twitter at DM Bronson. So folks are welcome to, follow or shoot us a DM or whatever. We'd be happy to talk to.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for being here today as we've talked about marriage and student ministry, looked at some of the challenge and blessings, and even some things that we could do to make our marriages stronger as we go forward. Student ministry it's a blessing. It can be fun. It can be exciting. It can be about deep conversations. At the same time, it can be about playing jungle pong or having a Nerf war. Mm-hmm. That's just part of the joy of being a student pastor. But we do it. We always do it because student ministry matters.
Thanks for listening to the Student Ministry Matters podcast. Get connected at studentministrymatters.com or follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Student Ministry Matters. Until next time, keep up the great work with your students because the work matters.